My name is Eric Stellwagen. I am the president and a co-founder of Business Forecast Systems, which is a firm outside of Boston that produces the Forecast Pro software, as well as offering educational services in the area of demand forecasting. I've been a forecaster for a while now. I've basically spent my entire career in this kind of demand forecasting arena. I have worked literally with hundreds of different companies to help them improve their forecasting process. And in doing so, I've really learned a lot about how different organizations approach forecasting processes and some of the best practices and some of the not so best practices that people use. So hopefully I'll try to get across some of my experience during today's webinar. With me is Sarah Darin. She'll be co-presenting the webinar, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Yeah. My name is Sarah Darin. I'm a senior consultant here at BFS. I've been at BFS for, I'm coming up on about 3 years now, but like Eric, I have spent most of my career, so over 20 years experience in analytics, working primarily with time series data. Most of my career has not really been in software. It has actually been in consulting, which means I have a lot of experience working with companies and lots of different clients who have strong opinions about what results and forecasts should look like. And usually those opinions are based on pretty good judgment. So consulting really is a great arena for learning how to incorporate those good judgments into a statistical process.
Okay. So here's a roadmap of how we're going to spend the next hour or so. And we're going to start off pretty general and be making some comments and looking at some pros and cons of incorporating judgment into your forecasting process. We'll see that there is a question of how you incorporate judgment, and we're going to be looking at a few specific ways that people do it. The first such way is in the form of a judgmental override. So the concept here is I have a baseline forecast, perhaps it's generated using a statistical method, and now I'm going to look at that forecast and decide whether I want to run with it, that is keep it as is, or make some changes to it based on perhaps my knowledge of future events. So a lot of judgment that's added to the forecasting process is done in the form of overrides. And it's tricky because sometimes when you make an adjustment to a forecast, you improve it. That's great. That's our goal, obviously. And other times you don't. You actually can make it less accurate. So we're going to be talking about best practices. When should you be applying judgment? And when will it add value? And when do you not? And we'll see that there's also a fair amount of research on this subject, and we'll talk a bit about that as well. We'll also look at something called the Delphi Method. This is a technique that's used when you need to come up with a consensus forecast. So we've got a group of people who are going to work together to come up with a forecast, and it tries to take away some of the politics and some of the negative group dynamics that can occur when you put a group of human beings together and try to discuss, hopefully, rather than argue about what a forecast should be. So we'll take a look at that. The third thing that we'll look at in terms of ways of applying judgment in your forecasting process is the use of what I've labeled here as a hybrid approach. And what I mean to convey there is that there are statistical approaches to generating forecasts. So, things like exponential smoothing and other models that take usually the past history and perhaps other information and come up with a quantitative forecast. And as we've already mentioned, you clearly can do a judgmental approach that does not use statistics. But what about using an approach that uses both? And so what we'll see is there are methods such as forecasting by analogy, which is a new product forecasting technique, where in addition to using quantitative information, say sales thus far, we're also going to need some judgmental inputs, like what are we going to base the product profile on? Or perhaps when we talk about regression modeling, then we've got a quantitative model, we're building a regression, but perhaps some of the inputs, such as the forecast for our explanatory variables, might be judgmentally derived. So we'll talk about approaches like this. We call them hybrid approaches, and one in particular that we'll take a close look at is something called the custom component model, which is really designed to allow a hybrid of judgment along with quantitative information. As Aidan has mentioned, we're saving time at the end for questions and answers. And so I do actually encourage you that send in your questions as they occur to you. Use the chat box to send them to Aidan. He'll be compiling them, and at the end we'll go through a number of them. If, as I think he mentioned this, but don't despair if we don't get to your question, because we'll follow up by email with a reply if we don't do it live during the seminar. Okay, so let's get started here. And in general, when you think about judgment, you can think about some pros and cons. So here's some pros. You don't need to be a statistician to come up with a judgmental forecast, so that's nice. The next one's the big one, which is there are times where you have knowledge about the corporate environment, about future events. You have knowledge of things that are important and will impact your forecasts. We call this domain knowledge. And the knowledge might derive from different sources. Maybe it's just the fact that you've worked at the company for a long time and understand how certain events unfold. Maybe if it's a new product, we've been showing it to customers and they're really excited about it, or we've been getting feedback from other sources. This kind of thing can be very difficult to incorporate into a statistical model, but it is very relevant to our expectations of what the forecast should be. So this concept of incorporating your knowledge of the process, your knowledge of the business, your knowledge of the future is extremely important. And at times, because it can be difficult to get into a quantitative model, it's best incorporated judgmentally. Other times, maybe not. So more on that later. It doesn't require historical data. And that's certainly important if we're dealing with lots of new products, for example. What's the downside? Well, judgmental forecasting is very subjective, and it can be biased. So a lot of companies struggle really with even the definition of what a forecast is. They can get it confused with things like sales goals or plans. It can be very political. I've gone into lots of organizations where you look at the judgmental adjustments that they're making, and it's like, well, why did you raise those numbers? And the answer is because my boss told me to. He said the forecast is too low. And again, I think what you're looking at there is really confusion as to the role of a forecast, which really should be our best estimate of what's going to happen, versus a goal, which might be what we would like to happen. And when somebody says raise the forecast because it should be higher, very often you want to look at that and say, are we really trying to generate a forecast, or are we confusing this with a goal? And perhaps if it's a goal, we need to spend more resources to achieve that goal. So the other thing about a judgmental forecasting process is that you can monitor it and determine how accurate it is, but it's hard to improve it because, like in a statistical model, you can monitor your accuracy and you can start to notice things like perhaps we are struggling with promoted products. The accuracy isn't as high as some of our other ones, or maybe the new product launches are more error prone. So it's easy to sort of spot where the problems are, and then with a statistical method, tweak it and maybe use different methods. Say for your promoted items, we'll go into models that can capture promotions, but we can improve the process by understanding where we're not performing as well as other areas, and then try to improve the statistical model. If our model is really just use your judgment, then how do you improve that? You can determine where you're not doing a good job, but improving it is much harder. The final bullet is noting that judgmental forecasting is not automatic. It requires time, and that is a resource. And so in some ways, it's, you know, it's an expensive way of generating a forecast in terms of resources. Okay, so before we start looking at how we enter judgment, let's just take a second and think about, you know, what are big picture ways, what are ways of entering judgment? Okay, one is really a completely judgmental approach. So if you're in an organization and you just say you go to a salesperson and you say, you need to generate a forecast and for all the products that you sell and submit it to me, and then we're going to use that to drive decision making. So notice that I'm not really providing any instructions on how they should generate the forecast. The salesperson is most likely not going to be trained in forecasting. And I'm also not providing them any sort of a structured way of doing it. I'm not telling them the steps involved in generating a forecast. This is rarely a good approach. In other words, there are organizations where the forecasting is simply, you know, come up with some numbers, and, you know, we go to Excel, maybe look at the history and start pushing in some numbers into the forecast. This can almost always be improved. Another way we could incorporate judgment is to first generate a statistical baseline forecast. So go ahead and use a statistical method. Again, like say if you're using Forecast Pro, we could run expert selection. We could use exponential smoothing. We could do a lot of any approach we want, but we come up with a baseline that's based on, in some sense, the past history. So it's kind of, if things continue the way they have been, here's what we can expect. Then we look at those forecasts and we ask ourselves, are they good forecasts, or do they need to be tweaked? And if we're considering using judgment, then the tweaking is usually by, again, entering some form of an override. So I've got a baseline forecast and I'm going to make changes to it based on my knowledge of the future. This is actually quite different than just coming up with a judgmental forecast. Let's think about that salesperson that we asked for a forecast. If we go to a salesperson and we say, here's a statistical baseline forecast. This is, you know, what we would expect to sell if things remain the same. I want you to review these forecasts, and I want you to tell me, I want you to make adjustments where you feel they are necessary, and tell me why. You know, document why you're making your changes. That is a much more structured exercise than just asking someone to come up with some numbers. Now it's really, is the baseline a good forecast? And if I'm going to change it, why? Why do I think I'll sell more than that? Why do I think I'll sell less than that? And perhaps they have some very good reasons. You know, we're going to have a new client coming online in 3 months, so I raised the forecast 20% because that's the kind of volume I expect to get out of this new client. Perfectly valid way of doing it. That new customer wasn't incorporated in the baseline forecast. You know, it's probably the right thing to do, but again, a different way of incorporating judgment than just saying, come up with a number. The last bullet is referring to something I mentioned in when we looked at our agenda, which is hybrid models. And we'll come back to this, but again, these are models that require both statistical inputs as well as judgmental ones. So judgment is critical. Judgment is important as a forecaster. You will always be using judgment as part of your responsibilities as a forecaster. Sometimes the judgment may be we don't need to change the statistical forecast, and other times it may be more involved than that. But judgment is important. There are some instances where it's particularly important, when there is limited or no data, or perhaps you have data but it's not really relevant. So things like new products, industries that are rapidly changing, a lot of times you're going to be using a fair amount of judgment in these cases. When you have knowledge of the future that's important, that will impact the forecast, and that is not part of the statistical model, that's another place where judgment is going to play a role. It could be knowledge of upcoming events, say promotions or policy changes, or maybe some competitive information about what your competitors are going to do. But the main thing is knowledge about the future that if we ignore, and it isn't part of our forecast, will result in less accurate forecasts. Sometimes that knowledge of the future can be incorporated in statistical models. So maybe if I have upcoming promotions, I could use a model that incorporates it directly. And at other times, you may be facing situations where incorporating it into a statistical model is not possible or practical. And so you resort to judgment. Okay, so we're going to now talk about adding judgment in the form of overrides. And I'm going to do this largely by example, and then Sarah will tell us about some best practices and research findings. But I'm going to start with just some basic ideas and give you a feel for this. So make sure the forecaster has visibility to the baseline forecasts when they're making their adjustments. Ideally, they'd be able to see the forecast both graphically and numerically. And probably if there's other important information that should be available while they're working with the numbers, make that available too. So the actual environment that they're making the changes is important. Second bullet, an important one, document all overrides made. Your forecasting process is just that. It's an ongoing process. And you want it to be well documented. When others have to look at the forecast adjustments that were made, they want to. Ideally they can read, the comments and your documentation and understand why these changes were made. The third one's also important. Track the accuracy of the adjusted forecasts as well as the statistical baselines. You need to understand where are the adjustments adding value and where are they not adding value. Furthermore, establish a feedback loop. Let the people who are making the adjustments know where they're adding value and where they're actually destroying value. That feedback loop's important, and what you're going to find is that if you can provide it, that people will start to really pay more attention and spend more time in the areas where they're at it, where their adjustments are adding value, and perhaps making fewer changes in places where the statistical forecasts are doing a good job. So how do we apply judgment as an override? Okay, I'm just going to show you an Excel spreadsheet. Here's a bunch of forecasts on an Excel spreadsheet. And in almost every single survey on forecasting software, there's going to be a question of, what software is used to generate forecasts? And the winner is always Excel. Probably shouldn't be. There are better ways of working with forecast numbers than in a spreadsheet environment, but it remains the case that the majority of forecasts are done in Excel. This is a pretty hard way to look at forecasts. I mean, I've got different SKUs here. They're broken out by customers and categories, and it's just a bunch of raw numbers. And it's kind of hard to spot things this way. I could make adjustments by typing in new numbers. I could add comments in Excel, obviously, and I could create a fancier spreadsheet to maybe try to get a graph in there and maybe some other information. So, do people make adjustments and review forecasts in Excel? Absolutely. It's very, very common. But it's different than going into some sort of structured environment. So here's an application. This is the Forecast Pro software. And this is a screen that's set up to help you make adjustments to your forecasts. And I could set this up a whole bunch of different ways, but some of the important thoughts here are, I can see the history in this case. I can see the forecasts graphically. Rather than just a bunch of numbers, I can see things like seasonal patterns. I can see things like trends. And as you work with data visually, you start to understand the data better. And this helps you in making your adjustments. You also need to see things numerically. So here is the baseline forecast in this grid. I've set up a couple of, this is a very simple example, but I've set up a couple of rows to make some adjustments. So I set up a row for demand planning, I set up a row for management, and let's just make a couple of changes here. I'm going to go and push this forecast up by, say, 15%. Okay, so I'll make those changes. I want to document why they were made. So I'm going to associate those changes with a comment. I'll just say increased for promotion. Okay, and I'll go ahead and commit to that. And notice now we've got our statistical forecast. It's still visible, but we also have the adjustments. And our final forecast is here, which reflects in this case that September, October, and November have been adjusted. So the statistical forecast for September is 21,000. I put in 24,000, and the final forecast is 24,000. So this is an example of making an adjustment as a replacement value. I'm replacing the statistical forecast with an adjusted number. And that's one way of doing it. I'll show you another way in a minute or two. There's other information on the sheet. And frankly, those who know me or have seen me make presentations in person know that I'm always telling people to get bigger monitors, okay? So I had to make a very simple sheet because I didn't have, under WebEx, the ability to make fancier graphs and bigger grids. But you can put information that may be useful when working with the data. So I put in, for example, in addition to units, I put in the dollars here. This sheet happens to have the orders that have already come in and made available at a promise here. But the main idea is create an environment where I can put in overrides easily, where I can document the changes, where I can look at the data visually as well as numerically. Over here, I can look at the data at different levels. I could look at customer levels and make changes. I could look at categories and make changes. I could look at SKUs and make changes. But this environment that you're working in is important. Okay. Now, I mentioned that I was making adjustments in the form of an override. This is the same data, but I've organized it a little differently. And now I want to talk about making adjustments as incremental overrides, which is something that a lot of organizations do. So now the concept is I have a statistical forecast just like before, but now I'm setting up, in this case, rows for things that might happen, like a new product launch or promotions or competitive actions. And I'm making changes based on that. So for example, for this, we're at a customer level, and there's going to be a new product launch for this customer that's going to expand our product line, and it's going to start in January. So I've put in these numbers here, this 20,000 and 14,000, et cetera, and it's not a replacement value. So the baseline forecast is 100,000. I'm adding 20,000 to it, and the final forecast is 120,000. So it's an incremental adjustment, an upward, downward adjustment to the baseline. In February, you can see we have some volume associated with the product launch. We also have some volume associated with a planned promotion, and the final forecast is, in this case, the sum of those things. You can see some of my incremental adjustments are negative because a competitor promotion is likely to take sales away from us. But the important thing here is that when we're making adjustments, we want to be in an environment where it's easy to look at and understand our data, where it's easy to document who made the changes, when were they made, and why. And if we organize our process properly, then it can really help make that a smooth and efficient process. Okay, let's go back to our slides here. And at this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Sarah to talk about some best practices and research findings. Thank you,
Eric. So one of the key academics who has spent a lot of time focusing on judgmental forecasting is Paul Goodwin. And just incidentally, Paul did a webinar for us maybe about 5 years ago now on judgmental adjustments in particular, on the research he has done. If you're interested in looking at that, it is in the archived webinars on our website, and it's certainly an interesting watch. But Paul has done a lot of research, and in particular, in 2007, he published a an article along with Robert Fields in Foresight magazine, and a lot of interesting stuff came out of that. One of those things was they had done a survey of 149 companies, and they found that over 75% of those companies were integrating judgment into their forecasting process. So this type of judgmental adjustments are very, very common, which leads us to the question of, are they a good practice? Do they improve accuracy? And I guess the simple answer to that is, on average, not really. But that's because people are making bad adjustments along with the good adjustments. In addition to Fields and Goodwin, there's another interesting paper on this by Galbraith and Merrill. And what they found in their research is that overrides were actually reducing forecasting accuracy in about 60% of companies. On the flip side of that, 40% of companies were probably doing a pretty good job with it. So that's good. And in that same 2007 Foresight article, Fields and Goodwin found that judgmental adjustments to a statistical forecast were reducing the MAPE, the mean absolute percentage error. So on average, let's say, the judgmental adjustments were making the forecasting accuracy worse. But that was taken across all types of adjustments that were being made. So that leads us to the question of, how do we know when judgment will add value, and how do we make sure that we're limiting ourselves to the cases where it will add value and not destroy forecasting accuracy? So one of the things that Paul actually focuses a lot, both in his webinar and in that paper, is pointing to some of the common mistakes that people make when they're making these adjustments. The first is getting too political. So often people are making adjustments for political reasons, not because they really believe that the forecast is inaccurate. So for example, Eric was talking about how, he's gone to lots of companies where, people are saying that they're adjusting the forecast up because that's what the boss wants to see. The boss has a certain sales goal, and bringing him a forecast that's too far below that goal is going to be a problem. So there's a political incentive to raise that forecast. Another example might be someone who works in the marketing department. They're in charge of a marketing campaign that is going to be measured. The impact of that campaign is measured as incrementality above and beyond the baseline forecast. From that perspective, there's actually an incentive for that person to want the baseline forecast to be lower. So to push that down so that the incrementality of the marketing campaign that they're running is actually larger. So a lot of things like that can be going on. Another thing that is really very common is that people make little tweaks to the forecast, mostly because they just want to show that they're doing a good job. So this is something that, as a statistician, I can say I don't mess with tweaking forecasts too much, but I certainly do fall victim to this. An example of that would be when someone sends me something that they want me to review, like an article or a presentation or something like that. I'll be going through, and often I will be making just like little changes that aren't necessarily adding a ton of value to the final product, but I'm making my mark. I'm showing that I actually went through and did what I was supposed to do, and that sending that to me was actually justified. So I think that there's that temptation for many people, both in forecasting and in other scenarios like reviewing papers. People also have a tendency to want to come up with a story to explain recent movements in the data. So they'll look at anecdotal evidence or recent news events as a basis for the story, and then they adjust the forecast to incorporate these anecdotes into it. But they don't really have any real supporting evidence. Part of the temptation to do that is that it makes the forecast more interesting. So they actually have a story to tell when they're explaining why the forecast is what it is. They can engage their audience better. but the goal is not an interesting forecast. The goal is an accurate forecast. So only adjust a forecast if there is true supporting evidence and justification for doing so. Incorporating personal biases. I think this one's actually pretty straightforward, and Eric certainly pointed to the fact that, you know, one of the big cons of judgmental forecasting is that it is subjective, and it's always going to be really hard to avoid that incorporation of personal biases. Making changes due to group pressures. Again, as Eric was saying, when you get a bunch of people in a room, there's going to be a lot of things going on there. There are going to be some strong personalities. There are going to be more senior people, more junior people. That environment can make it really difficult to try to make as objective a decision or change the forecast as possible. And we'll get into a little bit more detail with that also with the Delphi method. Seeing patterns in randomness. So it's really pretty common for people to start seeing patterns where they don't exist. In part, this actually might just be someone doing their job. So they want to do a really good job. They start looking at the historic sales, they're staring at it, and they just start seeing things in there. And those things have not been actually reflected in the statistical forecast. So I might be tempted to try to include those patterns in the forecast. But the fact is that people just really aren't very good at separating patterns or, in the engineering world, signals from noise. But this is actually something that statistical models do really well. So if you're looking at the data and you start thinking that they're uncaptured patterns, do two things. First of all, ask yourself, does this pattern make sense? If the answer to that question is yes, it makes sense, I can come up with a reason why that pattern might be there. The next thing is to test for that pattern in a statistical setting. If the statistical model isn't seeing that pattern, then it probably isn't real. So those are the mistakes. When should we be making adjustments? Well, again, don't bother with the small adjustments. I mean, that again is don't do those little tweaks. And in that Foresight article that Files and Goodwin wrote, one of the interesting findings that they have is that the small adjustments are actually taking away accuracy from the forecasting process, while bigger adjustments are the ones that tend to add value. So one way of improving forecasting accuracy is going to simply be don't bother with those little adjustments. Make sure that overrides are based on expertise, experience, as Eric was calling it, domain knowledge, and are integrating important, reliable, new information, which is not already incorporated. So again, this is going towards that avoiding the anecdotal stories, making sure that you are making a change that you can really stand behind, that you can really explain. And when you're doing that, that's likely to be a significant change, not a little tweak. And it's those significant changes, again, that are more likely to actually be adding value to your forecasting process. Document all overrides. This is one that Eric also has gone through in terms of making sure you understand what's working and then also developing that feedback loop and making sure that people understand what you have done. It also is a good way of making sure that that people aren't making those little tweaks, because if you need to document something, then you have to be able to put down a good reason for why you're doing it. Using structured methods to avoid bias. So that second example that Eric went through was what we call incremental changes. And this is a good example of a structured method. And the idea here is that instead of thinking about everything that might impact the forecast all at once, putting some structure around it and separating it into the different things that might be driving a change to the forecast. So a price promotion, a competitive promotion. So organizing things in a structured way. The Delphi method is another example of a structured method where instead of just coming up with a number, there's a process for how you arrive at that final change. Track accuracy and bias. So again, it's important to develop that, that feedback loop, certainly, and understand where the adjustments are adding value and where they're taking away value. Additionally, though, it's also important to understand if you are systematically overestimating or underestimating with your adjustments, and that's where bias comes in. Again, in that Fields and Goodwin paper, they actually suggest that it's the upward adjustments that tend to be taking away value more than the kind of more realistic or pessimistic downward adjustments. But so that's an interesting thing to track in your own organization and see whether you're over or undershooting. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Eric to go through the Delphi method.
Okay. So the Delphi method is a technique that's really designed to reduce the politics that occur when trying to come up with a consensus forecast, so, and the group dynamics that sometimes get involved. So if we're going to use the Delphi, we clearly are going to have more than one person involved in trying to come up with a judgmental forecast. So I'm going to just kind of describe this as an example. Let's say that the people involved in the forecast are going to be a CEO, and the director of marketing is also going to be involved in the process. And the director of sales, who does look remarkably like the director of marketing, is going to be involved in the process as well as for some reason, the mailroom clerk. Okay, so these are the four individuals who are going to be working together and come up with a forecast. So how do you do this? Well, here's one way. You can put these forecasters in a conference room and let them come up with a forecast. So what happens when you do that? Well, they're going to go into that conference room and they're going to start to talk. And if the CEO is speaking, then people are probably going to be reluctant to contradict her. And her voice is probably going to carry more weight than the other people in the room. What if the director of sales has a very forceful personality? What if he's, constantly pounding his opinions as given fact? So sometimes people's personalities can also direct the way a conversation goes about what a good forecast should be. The mailroom clerk may be the best forecaster in the bunch, but he's going to probably not say a whole lot in that conference room because he's low man on the totem pole and probably is a little bit intimidated by his more senior associates that are in the room with him. So again, this concept of there's politics involved in a consensus forecast. There's group dynamics in a consensus forecast. And these will come into play, and it doesn't always help the forecast. In many cases, it's going to really impact accuracy adversely. So what's another option? Well, the slide previously was labeled the Delphi method, so we're going to talk about a method called the Delphi method. How does it work? Okay. First, let's just we'll think of this as an example. We've got our four people that we talked about just a second ago. We have the CEO, the director of marketing, the director of sales, and the mailroom clerk. So we've got four different panelists, let's call them, and they're going to choose a facilitator. So the Delphi method requires someone to act as a facilitator. For our example, that will be me. Okay, so I'll be the facilitator. The process begins by each of the panelists coming up with a forecast, writing it down, and writing down some commentary, maybe a paragraph or two about why they think their forecast is a good one. And they send it to the facilitator, in this case me. So let's say that they all email me their forecasts and their commentary. What do? Well, I compile it into a single document, okay? But I don't identify who is who. So I'm going to start referring to forecaster A and forecaster B and forecaster C and forecaster D. In reality, one of them is the CEO, one of them's the director of marketing, one's the director of sales, one's the mailroom clerk. But in my commentary, you don't know who is who. So it's anonymous, and that's important. So I compile this, and then I send it back to them so that they can now look at the other people's forecasts and the other people's commentaries. And they can spend their time looking through there and thinking about it. And then they have the opportunity to revise their forecasts and revise their commentary and to send it back to me, okay? And that process will continue to iterate, so we can have as many rounds as you want to have. But typically what's going to happen is a consensus will start to emerge. And by keeping this anonymous, people are much more willing to do things like change their forecasts. You know, if you've been in that conference room and you've just made a speech on why you know the forecast is going to be increasing, and then somebody makes a good point that maybe it won't, it's kind of hard to back off of that. But in the Delphi method, it's all anonymous. So you can change your mind and you don't have those social pressures involved. And there's different variations on the Delphi. You know, sometimes you run a number of rounds and then you average the forecast to make it the final one. Other times, if it's an ongoing process, you might establish track records for the different participants and combine them using weights. There's a fair amount of literature on this. If you are interested in learning more about the Delphi, if you Google, you know, Delphi method forecasting, you'll come up with plenty of information about it. So again, it's a very specific judgmental approach. It really is a structured process. It's designed to get the politics out of the consensus forecasting process. It doesn't allow personalities to get involved. So if I've got a really strong personality, it's harder for them to bully the group into accepting their forecast. The fact that it's anonymous is important, and it just allows people the flexibility of changing their opinions, changing their forecasts without losing face, so to speak, without having to appear to be backing down from positions they've made previously. So it's not rocket science, but it can be advantageous. It's obviously a fair amount of work. So this is, you know, it does require some time. When I've seen it in use, it tends to be for bigger decisions. And so, you know, things like product launches and moving into different areas in the company. It's not something you would do for, like, you know, obviously for the SKUs in a warehouse, you're not going to be using the Delphi. But it's an important, as a forecaster, it's an important method to at least know about and be aware that it is available if the need arises. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to turn the presentation back over to Sarah, who's going to talk about some hybrid approaches.
Thank you again, Eric. So again, as a reminder, what we're talking about with a hybrid approach is really integrating judgment into a statistical model and the different ways that we might be able to do that. But before we jump into that entirely, Eric mentioned a little bit before that, you know, one of the reasons that we're doing judgmental forecasting often is because we have domain knowledge, such as, you know, things about future promotions and things like that, that we want to integrate into the forecast. And as he said, that can often be done with just a statistical model, like an event model or a regression model, and that probably is a good practice, so that if you have domain knowledge about something that is going to happen and you can do it within a statistical model, you should. But you only can do it if what you're trying to integrate is something that has happened historically. So if you're trying to integrate information about, for example, promotion that has not happened historically, you're pretty much stuck with having to use some type of judgment here. So in terms of the different types of models that where we're doing hybrid forecasting. Forecasting by analogy, and this is very frequently used for new products. And the idea here is You have a new product, you don't have any historic data on it, but you need to come up with a forecast. So since you don't know anything about your the actual historic sales, since they don't exist, the next best thing is to look for products, historic new product launches that you expect to be a good guide for how this this launch is going to look. So basically, you look at previous launches, see how those sales rolled out over time, and use that as a basis for what the forecast for your new product should be. So this is something that we definitely see very commonly done with the Forecast Pro software. Regression-based scenario forecasting. The idea here is that often you might have developed a good statistical, for example, regression model. Suppose you have weather as an important driver of electricity usage. That's great. You can look back, and weather is clearly very important. You need to take into consideration when you're coming up with your electricity usage forecast. But weather is really difficult to forecast, and you're not likely to do it accurately. So when you're coming up with that weather forecast to feed into your electricity usage regression model, you're going to have to use judgment in terms of what that might, what the weather might look like for that. And one of the things that's typically done there is to come up with different weather scenarios. So you might come up with a hot weather scenario, an average weather scenario, and a cold weather scenario, and feed those into the regression model, and then you come out with a hot weather electricity usage forecast, etc. So there's judgment going into the scenarios, and then there's also some judgment. You know, what you're left with is a forecast for a bunch of different scenarios, and you need to have some judgment about the likelihood of those different scenarios actually playing out as you come up with the final forecast. Another common and very simple, and actually probably research shows pretty effective hybrid approach is simply combining the statistical and judgment forecasts. And this is typically as simple as taking just a simple average. So you might have a judgmental forecast of 120 for a given month, a statistical forecast of 100. Your final forecast comes out to 110. So there's actually been a good amount of research that this type of combining forecasts will actually have a positive impact on your forecast accuracy. And finally, Forecast Pro's custom component model. So this really is a model that was developed exactly for this purpose. The idea that at times you want to remain true to a statistical model as you can, but you might want to change some of those assumptions in a judgmental type of way. So the integration of judgment into that model. And I think this will be easiest to see via example here. So what we're looking at here, this is actually the same data that Eric had been showing before, and it is bakery butter cakes. And this actually is the same forecast that Eric started out with too. We're looking at a 1-year horizon here. And when we look at this forecast shown in the red line, we can see that the seasonality is captured and repeated. There's a small trend that's being captured, and it looks pretty reasonable. And if we look down at the model here, we can see that's a exponential smoothing model, multiplicative winters model, and we can see all the parameters. Now suppose we're tasked with having to forecast out 5 years instead. So we go ahead and do that. Exact same model. But once we look at this 5-year forecast, we start seeing that it's growing pretty aggressively. So in the end of our historic data, we were about 50,000 units for the peak month of December. And by the end of our forecast here, we're up to 86,000, almost 87,000. So we're looking at 70% growth over that 5 years. And that might feel pretty aggressive, at least it does to me. So one of the things that the custom component model does is it allows us to alter some of that. So as a starting point, the custom component model starts with an exponential smoothing model. And you can actually see here that the expert selection exponential smoothing model here is reflected as the starting point for the component model. So the level of 16,788 is this starting point value here. The slope is the same as what our trend value is. So it's the same model. And now we're able to adjust some of these components from judgmentally if we think that they should be adjusted. So here we were feeling that the trend might be a little bit too aggressive. And we have a few options about how we might be able to change that trend. We have a linear custom where in that case we would be able to directly change what this slope is or what the endpoint is. And we also have this bent custom. What the bent custom does is it allows us to slow down the trend. So we might want to make sure that the trend going to year 1 is similar to what it is now, but as we go into year 2, 3, 4, and 5, that trend is slowing down a little bit. So the idea here is that we're bending it downward. So I'm going to go ahead with this bent custom as an example. And what we're going to do is we're going to leave it at the estimated 236, but let's say we're going to see it slowing down 50% each time period, basically each month. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to hit apply. And what you can see now is that this final point here, which had been about, let me have to close out this quickly, which had been about 87,000 is now down to 69,000. So this might now seem like a more reasonable forecast for us to look at. The other way that the custom component model can be very useful is, I took it away. Apologies, let's just go here. The other way that can be useful is it can allow you to integrate the impact of events that have not yet happened. So if we go over here, I had previously created an event schedule called BOGO. And what this schedule is doing is, suppose we are going to actually have a buy one, get one free in this next month. So this is, I believe, in July of 2019. And we've never done this before. So I set up an event schedule. I say that we're going to have a buy one, get one free that month. And at this point, it hasn't happened historically. So Forecast Pro doesn't have an estimate except to say that there's no impact. But what we can do is we can go ahead in here and change it judgmentally. So I'm going to choose this custom multiplicative. My experience is that buy one, get one free. They have at least twice as many sales as otherwise. So there's that and the reduced price. So let's say that this actually has a 200% impact. So I'm going to see that happen. And I'm going to move this over so we can see that week. And when we hit apply, look at that first, we see that this first period has now moved up significantly. So this can be a good way integrating those future events that we don't really have a good measure of yet. And yes, it is judgmental that we're saying this BOGO will have an index of 3, but we're integrating it into a pretty solid statistical model. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Eric to summarize.
Okay, so let's pop back to our slides here. And just some final comments here. Judgment is important. As a forecaster, you need to be using judgment. Again, there are times where it's more important than others. So things like new products, rapidly changing environments, times where you may know things about the future that are not incorporated into your statistical model. So judgment is simply part of being a forecaster. When you're applying judgment, there's different ways of doing it. And you want to think about this, and you want to come up with a structure that makes sense for you and your organization. So, you know, some organizations will have structured processes like S&OP meetings where they talk about things, and this leads to changes and making sure we get input from different groups. We saw examples of incremental overrides where the adjustments were made for specific types of changes, or maybe the Delphi method, another structured approach. Hybrid models, models that leverage both historic data to come up in our custom component model example, you know, to come up with the seasonal pattern, we used a quantitative method, but then Sarah went and changed the underlying trend judgmentally. So sometimes this combination of using both data-based quantitative information along with judgment can be useful. Very often, organizations are applying judgment in the form of an override. So they have a baseline forecast, and then they review it, and they make changes where they feel it's appropriate. There's been a lot of research on this as to where it adds value and where it does not add value. And we had a couple of slides about best practices. And we encourage you that if this is the way that you're applying judgment, that you try to follow the best practices and keep in mind some of the things that Sarah reviewed. Finally, you know, you can't improve what you don't measure. So you need to track your accuracy. You need to understand, if we're going to be adding judgment to our forecasting process, where does it add value? Because as the research has shown, it doesn't always add value. So you really need to understand, where are you adding value, where are you destroying value, and that's going to drive improvements to the judgmental portion of your forecasting process. Okay, a couple of words, and then we'll take a few questions. I do want to mention that today's webinar is part of an ongoing webinar series. We give a live webinar basically every quarter. As attendees, you'll be receiving a notification from us about our next webinar once it's scheduled. And I do want to remind people that all of the webinars that we've presented are available for free in what we call our webinar archive, which is located at forecastpro.com. So if you haven't checked that out, I encourage you to do so. And we will be sending you, once the recording of today's webinar is available, we'll send you a link to that as well. I also want to mention in September 11th through 13th, we'll be presenting a 3-day workshop in San Francisco, California. And it's really, this is a very applied look at business forecasting. We're going to review different statistical methods for generating forecasts, best practices across the board, lots of real world examples, opportunity to work with your own data as well. And actually, Sarah and I will be the instructors for that class, and hopefully some of you can join us there. And San Francisco in September is often a pretty nice place to be as well. Okay, you may have noticed that the examples today use the Forecast Pro software. If you are interested in learning more about Forecast Pro, we'd love to help you understand more. Probably the best way to learn about the software is to get a demo. And we do that by WebEx. It is free. We can even use your own data. And we do offer trial versions as well. But I'd encourage you to visit our website. If you are interested in getting a demo, you just let us know. And in fact, you can even use the chat box if you want to send us a little note saying, you know, schedule me for a demo. We'll pass that along to one of our sales guys, and they'll be in touch and help you out. Okay, so at this point, we are running a little bit late, but we have time for 1 or 2 quick questions.
Yeah. So if there is not enough data for a statistical model to automatically pick up the trend or seasonal pattern, but using your domain knowledge and visual inspection of the data, you can easily identify a trend or seasonal pattern, how do you incorporate that knowledge into your forecast to yield more accurate results?
Okay, so that's a good question. Let me take a crack at that. So again, I have what they're describing is there's not enough data to get at a seasonal pattern, but I know it's seasonal. Okay, so there's kind of a dilemma. If I'm using some sort of automatic approach, let's say I'm using Expert Selection in Forecast Pro, and I've only got 8 months worth of data, it's not going to be able to build a seasonal model. I don't even have a full year's worth of data. So I think what the answer here is, you need to be pragmatic. If you know the data are seasonal, you need to build a seasonal forecast. You could be taking a seasonal pattern from something you feel is similar as a starting point, but a baseline that's just projecting the past is not going to work because you don't have enough data. So there are a new product forecasting techniques that can allow you to do that, and there is a recorded webinar on that, so I'd encourage you to visit there.
Okay. And another question is, how do overrides impact safety stock or reorder point calculations?
Okay. I'll take that one.
Sure,
Is that okay?
go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so I often say things get specific pretty quickly. Okay. A forecast is an input into safety stocks and reorder points. But it's going to depend on how you're making those calculations. In general, there's a question of, if you make an override, let's say the forecast was 500 and we changed it to 700. There's a question of, is that 200, does it have variability as to what that override should be? If it was something like, we have a one-time order from the US government for 200 units, then it probably shouldn't impact your safety stock at all, because it's just your adjustment was for a known quantity that doesn't have variability. On the other hand, if it's no, I expect the volume to be up, but there's variability around it, then probably that should impact your safety stocks. But now we get into the specific part, which is how are you actually creating those safety stocks and how are you creating the reordered points? And I can't answer that in a completely generic fashion. I'd have to know the details. So, okay, I think that uses up our time. As we mentioned, if we did not get to your question, we will be returning to it by email. I do want to thank everybody for taking some time out of their day to learn a little bit about judgmental adjustments and your forecasting process. I hope you've come away from this presentation perhaps with some ideas and some new knowledge, and I hope that you'll join us for future webinars. So thank you very much.